March 16th of the year 1911, a young German couple in the southern state of Bavaria welcomed a son into the world. As they doted on him, the two new parents wondered what exciting adventures life had in store for their darling baby boy. Yet little did they know, the name they gave him would become synonymous with some of the most hideous acts of cruelty the world has ever known. They named him Josef Mengele, but he would go on to earn the nickname Todesengel, which in English means angel of death. Little Josef displayed signs of advanced intelligence from an early age and showed talents for music, art, and winter sports. He graduated high school in April of 1930, then went on to study philosophy at the University of Munich, and it was here that Josef first took an interest in the politics of the extreme far right. The following year, he joined an organization known as the Steel Helmets, a right-wing paramilitary group comprised mostly of First World War veterans that had close ties to the Nazi Party. So close, in fact, that just a few years later, they were willingly absorbed into the Nazis' own paramilitary unit, the Storm Detachment, or SA, with young Josef following close behind. 2 years following his graduation from the University of Munich in 1935, Josef found work at Frankfurt's Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene. By this point, Hitler and the Nazis wielded absolute control over the German state, and as the name suggests, the Institute for Racial Hygiene was merely a tool by which to implement their nightmarish plan for the German people. By the time he was hired by the Frankfurt Institute, Josef was a fanatical Nazi and was fully invested in their hideous racial pseudosciences. Yet it wasn't just race that fascinated Josef, it was genetics as a whole. And during his tutelage under German geneticist Ottmar Freyer von Verschuer, Josef developed a near-manic obsession with identical twins. In 1938, Josef submitted his thesis, which focused on the genetic factors that result in lip, chin, or palate clefts. His work earned him a doctorate in medicine from the University of Frankfurt in 1938, with his examiners praising his reliability and his ability to verbally present complex material in a cleaner manner. The young medical student and rabid Nazi was now Dr. Josef Mengele. A year before he earned the title, Mengele had officially joined the National Socialist Party. Then, not long after becoming a doctor, he applied to join Hitler's elite personal protection squadron, the SS. He became a medic in their military wing, the Waffen-SS, and served during the invasion of Poland as the equivalent of a second lieutenant. Once the territory had been conquered and the Polish state dissolved, Mengele was assigned to the SS Race and Settlement Office in Poznan, where he evaluated certain candidates' racial backgrounds prior to their potential adoption as a genetically Aryan citizen. A few years later, during the multinational fascist invasion of the Soviet Union, Mengele was seriously wounded following a battle near the city of Rostov. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, the Wound Badge in Black, and the Medal for the Care of the German People, but later declared medically unfit for further military service during the summer of 1942. Unable to fight, but still itching to serve the Third Reich, Dr. Mengele was transferred to the SS Race and Settlement Office in Berlin, where he continued his work with Ottmar Freyer von Verschuer, who by that point was head of the Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. Mengele and von Verschuer enjoyed a fruitful working relationship, but after just a few months of researching together, the elder scientist made a suggestion to his younger colleague. Von Verschuer had gotten word of a top-secret Nazi science program which was involved in a cutting-edge research project somewhere in southern Poland. Mengele was told that if he joined the project, he'd have access to the kind of laboratory conditions that those back in Berlin could only dream of, and would have the potential to become one of the most preeminent scholars in his field. Mengele needed no time to consider the proposition, and within days he boarded a train which took him on a 350-mile journey to the small Polish village of Brzezinka. At this point, Many of the train's passengers disembarked, but for Dr. Mengele, this wasn't his terminal destination. For him, and just a handful of other passengers, the train would roll on to one more stop, to a 15-square-mile barbed wire compound that he and his comrades called Auschwitz. The site, which later became known as Auschwitz-Birkenau, was originally a Polish army barracks, but following the German invasion, the SS, Hitler's elite political cadre, converted it into a prisoner of war camp. The camp's original inmates were Polish soldiers, but as time went on, more and more political prisoners were sent to the camp, along with German criminals brought into function as brutally sadistic prefects. The first executions by gassing took place in August of 1941, which served as a successful dry run for the industrial-scale horrors that would follow. Construction of a larger sister camp began the following month, hence the name Auschwitz II, and then over the next 2 years, 1.3 million people were imprisoned there, while just over 1 million of them would be murdered for things as arbitrary as the circumstances of their birth or who they were attracted to. Millions were gassed, but an unfathomable number also lost their lives to starvation, disease, or summary executions. Others were killed during sickening medical experiments, many of which were led by none other than Dr. Josef Mengele himself. While Auschwitz was operational, it functioned as both a labor camp and a death camp. But this forced the camp's functionaries to divide them into 2 categories upon their arrival: those that could work and those that would be murdered. Of those declared unfit for work, around 75% of them were women, children, and the elderly. The vast majority of these people would be gassed just hours following their arrival, but some were selected for what is arguably an even more sinister purpose: medical experimentation. Upon his arrival at the camp in 1943, Dr. Mengele was appointed physician of the portion of the camp which housed Romani prisoners. One of his deputies was to evaluate the recovery process of any sick prisoners, and if Dr. Mengele decided that they weren't recovering fast enough, they'd be dumped into the gas chambers with the next shipment of the condemned. Dr. Mengele also took part in the process by which workers would be separated from the condemned. But unlike most other SS doctors who supposedly viewed selections as one of their most stressful and unpleasant duties, Dr. Mengele relished the opportunity to play God, and could often be seen smiling or whistling before or after the process. Yet perhaps one of the reasons Dr. Mengele enjoyed selection so much was that it provided him with a vast selection of human guinea pigs. As we've already discussed, Mengele was particularly fascinated with identical twins and triplets, and it's commonly believed that it stemmed from his desire to swell Germany's population. Essentially, Mengele believed that if he could isolate the specific biological process whereby a fertilized egg splits into 2 separated embryos, he could engineer a massive boom in the number of so-called Aryan Germans. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed mothers could undergo a treatment whereby their single Aryan baby would become 2 Aryan babies, exploding Germany's population growth by up to 200% over the course of a single generation. Dr. Mengele's theories so impressed the higher-ups that he received hundreds of thousands of Reichmarks in funding, and he was even granted his own personal laboratory located in one of Auschwitz's crematorium compounds. Unlike the majority of the camp's victims, Mengele's test subjects were relatively well-fed and were housed in comparative luxury. This good-natured facade meant that, in a sickening twist of irony, Dr. Mengele was an alarmingly popular figure. He often gave out candy to the camp's children, who either out of affection or trepidation referred to him as Uncle Josef. He was capable of being so kind to the children, said one of Mengele's former colleagues. He'd bring them sweets, he'd learn their names. It was like he really cared about them. Then the next minute, he was picking them out to be sent to the crematorium. Whenever he performed tests on twins, Dr. Mengele oversaw weekly physicals to ensure that they were at peak health before beginning the experiments. It's also important to note that Mengele rarely experimented on both twins at the same time, as one child could serve as the test subject while the other played the part of the control subject. These experiments included things like amputating healthy limbs to see if one twin felt the pain of the other, deliberately infecting them with diseases such as typhus to see how each twin reacted, or transferring the blood of one twin into another in order to trigger an antibody response. Hundreds of children died during the procedures, and even those who survived were eventually executed and dissected for the benefit of comparative post-mortem reports. On one occasion, Mengele murdered 7 pairs of identical twins within minutes of each other by injecting chloroform directly into their hearts. On another, he surgically removed the healthy kidney of a Polish prisoner of war. Then, during what should have been a period of recuperation, Mengele forced the prisoner to perform hard labor without painkillers in order to observe the physiological effects of the man's unimaginable suffering. Other twins were surgically attached to one another in a sickening attempt to create sets of conjoined siblings. Mengele also injected chemicals into his victims' eyes in attempts to artificially change their eye color, and sometimes forced them to undergo unnecessary drug and X-ray treatments for the purpose of recording the results. As covered earlier, the human experimentation that occurred in Auschwitz was a highly classified Nazi military secret, resulting in the utmost security measures being enforced to ensure that it remained classified. For the prisoners, this meant that when their time as a human test subject came to an end, they were almost immediately put to death. The monsters of the SS could not risk their enemies discovering the full extent of their crimes against humanity, and dead children tell no tales. When Dr. Mengele commenced his horrifying experiments, Nazi Germany was still confident that it would win the war. However, by January of 1945, the Nazis were looking at a very different outcome. France had been liberated, Italy had been knocked out of the war, and the Soviets were pouring through Eastern Europe using their vast manpower to outpace the Western Allies in their bloodthirsty quest for revenge against the German invader. By the time the Red Army reached southern Poland, the SS began the evacuation of those working at Auschwitz while coordinating the liquidation of its inmates. Tens of thousands of Russians, Poles, homosexuals, and Jewish people were gassed in shifts that continued completely unceasing for days at a time. Then one day, the SS simply vanished. By the time Soviet soldiers were gazing in horror at the industrial-scale death machine the Nazis had created, Dr. Mengele had already rid himself of all SS insignia and disguised himself as an unremarkable army officer and escaped westward to Czechoslovakia. From there, he continued his journey west, then surrendered himself to the Americans under an assumed identity in June of 1945. Many members of the SS had their blood type tattooed on their inner bicep, and were thus easy to identify as belonging to the hated Schutzstaffel. For some reason, Dr. Mengele did not have this tattoo, and, owing to the general disorganization of the Allies' denazification process, was able to remain undetected. He was eventually released just a month later and obtained false identity papers under the name Fritz Hollmann. Incredibly, Mengele then traveled back to Soviet-occupied Poland, sought out the paper trail which implicated him in the Nazis' crimes against humanity, and almost completely destroyed them. He remained undetected until 1949, when his fear of discovery led him to flee to Argentina under the identity of a Bavarian farmhand named Helmut Gregor. In the Argentine capital of Buenos Aires, Dr. Mengele found work as a carpenter while staying in a quaint suburban boarding house. Incredibly, he became so comfortable living in Argentina that he became a salesman representative for his family's farm equipment company, Carl Mengele and Sons. Files released by the Argentine government in 1992 indicate that Mengele may have practiced medicine without a license while living in Buenos Aires, including performing abortions. Then, in 1956, Mengele managed to obtain a copy of his original birth certificate, then used it to apply for an Argentine passport in his original name. Once he was able to travel internationally, Mengele made an emotional pilgrimage to the nation of his birth and met with his widowed sister-in-law, Martha, before spending a week in his hometown of Günzburg in Bavaria. He also had a tearful reunion with his only son Rolf, albeit under the impression that Mengele was his paternal uncle and not in fact his father. After returning to South America in September of 1956, Mengele was so confident that he'd gotten away with his crimes that he dropped his forged identities and began living out in the open. He was soon followed by his sister-in-law as well as her son, and the trio began living together in Mengele's Buenos Aires home. Mengele and Martha married in 1958, and for a while, the future seemed bright. But after being charged with practicing medicine without a license, Mengele began to worry that his Nazi past was about to catch up with him. He relocated his new family to Paraguay and was granted citizenship shortly afterwards under the name Jose Mengele. He made trips to Argentina on several occasions to settle his business affairs and visit his family, and slowly but surely, he began to feel comfortable again. But little did he know, the gears of justice have been in motion for a long, long time, and his masquerading as an innocent man was drawing short. Back in the 1940s, during the now infamous Nuremberg trials, Mengele's name had been mentioned several times during the proceedings. However, since he'd completely slipped through their Nazi dragnet, those responsible for his apprehension had assumed that he was dead. This was also down to the fact that Mengele's relatives back in his Bavarian hometown had also reported that Josef had been killed in action during the frantic Soviet advance. However, while performing research in West Germany, two dedicated Nazi hunters made an intriguing discovery. If Dr. Josef Mengele was killed during the final days of World War II, why was his name on a set of Argentinian divorce papers dated after the cessation of hostilities? Convinced he'd foiled the escape of a genuine Nazi war criminal, Longbine pressured the West German authorities to begin extradition proceedings within Argentina, and an arrest warrant was issued on June 5th of 1959. Longbine was as shocked as he was delighted when Argentina openly admitted to harboring Dr. Mengele, yet was disappointed to hear that he'd absconded to Paraguay. Frustrated with the lack of South American cooperation, Longbine informed the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad, that he suspected Mengele to be living on a farm in rural Paraguay, somewhere near the border with Argentina. The following summer, in May of 1960, Mossad's chief hoped to bag Mengele in the same operation that saw Nazi official Adolf Eichmann brought to justice. Yet unlike Eichmann, Mengele proved much harder to track. He stayed one step ahead of his pursuers and contacted a secretive cell of Nazi sympathizers in Brazil, who smuggled him into the country towards the end of the year. Whilst in Brazil, Mengele met a pair of Hungarian expats who paid him to manage their coffee and cattle farms in a place called Sierra Negra. The Hungarians were initially unaware of his identity and attempted to evict him once they learned of his past. But Mengele and his Nazi friends essentially blackmailed the couple and threatened to implicate them in the plot to hide him in the event of his apprehension. Mossad called off the hunt for Mengele in 1962, and he lived a somewhat nomadic lifestyle as an unrepentant Nazi until his death 10 years later. Mengele had been swimming in the coastal waters of the Bertioga beach resort when he suffered a stroke and drowned. In a perverse twist of irony, the man who'd spent a large portion of his life ensuring the final moments of millions were fraught with pain and suffering spent his final hours in relative peace, enjoying the comfort and luxury of sun, sea, and sand. Years later, in February of 1985, the mystery behind Mengele's whereabouts gained a great deal of public interest when a mock trial for him was held in Jerusalem. The trial prompted the Western Allies to mount a huge coordinated search effort, one that aimed to bring Mengele back to Germany, either dead or alive. This led to a raid on the home of Hans Sedlmayr, a lifelong friend of Dr. Mengele, whereby a coded address book was recovered. Investigators also found copies of letters written by Mengele, many of which gave clues to his whereabouts in South America, but it was through the address book that they were able to locate Mengele's grave. On June 6th of 1985, the 41st anniversary of the D-Day landings, representatives of the US, Israel, and West Germany convened at a small cemetery in the Brazilian state of São Paulo. There, they sought to exhume the corpse of a man they believed to be none other than the angel of death himself, Dr. Joseph Rudolf Mengele. It took 7 years, but in 1992, DNA testing proved beyond all doubt that the corpse belonged to Mengele. However, in what seemed to be one final display of defiance, Mengele's surviving relatives refused to allow his corpse to be expatriated from Brazil to his native Germany. Instead, Mengele's skeleton is stored at the São Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, where it's used as an educational aid during forensic medicine courses. In a way, it seems apt that a man who conducted human experimentation is now himself a tool for education. But unlike his victims, Josef Mengele escaped a painful and untimely execution. It's a comfort to think that so many of his fellow Nazis faced justice following the horrors of the Holocaust, even if it did take more than a decade in 1 or 2 cases. But the life and death of Dr. Josef Mengele are not only a reminder of man's ability to commit unfathomable acts of evil, but also that some stories don't have a happy ending.